400 soldiers watched from the parade ground as General Marcus Thornfield stepped forward, his chest medals catching the desert sun like armor. He'd built his reputation on breaking the will of recruits who thought they were tougher than the system. Today, he'd spotted what he believed was his easiest target yet. But what happened next in those 12 minutes would be talked about in military academies for decades to come. And by the end of it, every witness would question everything. They thought they knew about true strength. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The heat at Fort Meridian rose from the concrete like visible waves, distorting the air above the sprawling military installation nestled in the heart of Nevada's high desert. This wasn't just any base, it was the crown jewel of advanced military training, where the country's finest came to push beyond their limits before deployment to the world's most dangerous theaters. The morning sun painted everything in shades of amber and bronze, from the towering communications array to the endless rows of barracks that housed over 8,000 active personnel. Captain Sarah Chen stepped out of the medical assessment building, her boots creating small puffs of dust with each measured step. At 32, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned early that actions spoke louder than words. Her slight frame, barely 5'4", and weighing perhaps 130 pounds soaking wet, seemed almost fragile against the backdrop of the massive installation. She moved with an economy of motion that came from years of physical therapy. Work, each gesture deliberate and purposeful. 3 weeks earlier, she had arrived at Fort Meridian as part of a joint services initiative to revolutionize combat rehabilitation protocols. Her civilian credentials were impressive enough: doctorate in physical therapy from Stanford, specialized training in biomechanics from Johns Hopkins, consultant work with Olympic athletes recovering from career-threatening injuries. But it was her military background that had caught the attention of the brass. 8 years as a Navy corpsman, including 2 tours in Afghanistan where she had literally carried wounded Marines to safety under enemy fire, had earned her a chest full of commendations and the kind of respect that couldn't be bought or faked. The assignment at Fort Meridian was supposed to be straightforward. Develop new rehabilitation techniques for soldiers recovering from combat injuries, create training protocols that would prevent common battlefield ailments, and establish a program that could be replicated across all branches of service. Simple enough, except that military tradition and medical innovation didn't always shake hands politely. Sarah had spent her first 2 weeks walking the base, observing existing protocols, interviewing medical staff, and quietly taking notes in a worn leather journal she kept in her cargo pocket. She attended physical training sessions at dawn, watched combat drills in the afternoon heat, and spent her evenings reviewing case files of soldiers struggling with everything from torn rotator cuffs to traumatic brain injuries. The patterns she observed weren't encouraging. Too many soldiers were pushing through pain instead of addressing root causes. Too many training regimens focused on brute force rather than sustainable strength. Too many career-ending injuries that could have been prevented with proper biomechanical understanding. She'd seen it before in her civilian practice, but the military context added layers of complexity that textbook solutions couldn't address. The culture at Fort Meridian was old school in the most traditional sense. Physical prowess was measured in maximum bench presses and fastest mile times. Mental toughness was demonstrated through the ability to ignore pain and push beyond reasonable limits. It was a system that produced undeniably effective warriors, but it also produced a steady stream of broken bodies that Sarah was now tasked with fixing. Her morning routine had become ritual by now. First light found her in the base gymnasium, not lifting weights or running laps like most of the personnel, but moving through a series of exercises that looked more like dance than traditional military fitness. Controlled movements that emphasized perfect form over maximum load, breathing techniques that seemed almost meditative, stretching sequences that could have come from a yoga studio rather than a combat training manual. The reactions from the regular gym users ranged from polite curiosity to barely concealed amusement. She'd caught more than a few sideways glances and overheard whispered comments about the tiny doc who thinks she's teaching warriors how to breathe. None of it bothered her particularly. She'd faced skepticism before, and she knew that results spoke louder than opinions. But this morning felt different as she approached the central parade ground, where the weekly all-hands formation was scheduled. To begin, word had spread through the unofficial networks that today's assembly would include demonstrations from various departments about new training initiatives. Sarah's presentation was listed third on the agenda, sandwiched between a briefing on updated small arms maintenance and a demonstration of new tactical communication equipment. The parade ground at Fort Meridian was a monument to military precision, a perfectly flat expanse of concrete that could accommodate the entire base population in neat formation. Bleachers along the eastern edge provided seating for visiting dignitaries and senior staff, while the western side was dominated by a raised platform where commanding officers could address the assembled troops. The American flag snapped smartly in the desert breeze, and the base's motto, "Excellence through adversity," was emblazoned in 6-foot letters across the platform's facade. As Sarah walked toward the designated staging area, she could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes tracking her movement. It wasn't hostility exactly, more like professional curiosity mixed with the kind of skepticism that greeted any outsider trying to change established systems. She'd learned to recognize that look during her years in the field, and she'd also learned that the best response was usually patient demonstration rather than lengthy explanation. The formation was already beginning to take shape as company after company moved into position with the fluid precision that came from countless repetitions. 1st Battalion formed up on the left flank, their woodland camouflage creating neat geometric patterns under the morning sun. 2nd Battalion claimed the center, while 3rd Battalion filled in the right side with equal precision. Support personnel, medical, logistics, intelligence formed additional ranks behind the main combat units. Sarah found herself scanning the assembled faces, noting the incredible diversity of backgrounds and specialties represented in just this single formation. Combat engineers who could build bridges under fire, communications specialists who could maintain contact across impossible distances, medics who could perform life-saving surgery in conditions that would challenge most civilian hospitals. Each of them was an expert in their field. Each had been pushed to their limits during training, and each carried the confidence that came from knowing they could depend on their teammates when everything went wrong. But she also noticed the subtle signs that civilians would miss. The way Sergeant Morrison from 2nd Company favored his left knee, probably compensating for an old jump injury that had never quite healed properly. The careful way Lieutenant Rodriguez held her right shoulder, suggesting rotator cuff damage that was being managed rather than corrected. The slightly altered stance of at least a dozen soldiers who were clearly dealing with lower back issues, their weight distribution adjusted to minimize discomfort during extended periods of standing at attention. These were the warriors she was here to help, and most of them had no idea how much better they could feel with proper intervention. The military mindset that made them incredibly effective in combat, the ability to push through pain, ignore discomfort, and maintain performance despite physical limitations, was also what made them resistant to acknowledging that pain might be a problem worth solving rather than simply enduring. From her position near the staging area, Sarah could see the senior staff beginning to file onto the platform. Colonel Davidson, the base commander, moved with the measured authority of a man who had spent 3 decades turning civilians into soldiers. Major General Patricia Wells, visiting from Pentagon oversight, carried herself with the sharp precision that came from navigating the highest levels of military bureaucracy. And there, taking his place at the right side of the platform with an expression that suggested he found the morning's proceedings mildly entertaining, stood General Marcus Thornfield. Sarah had heard about Thornfield before arriving at Fort Meridian, though their paths had never crossed during her active duty years. 52 years old, career infantry officer who had risen through the ranks during some of the military's most challenging decades. 3 combat deployments, 2 Bronze Stars, and a reputation for producing soldiers who could handle anything the enemy threw at them. He was old school in the purest sense, a believer in the idea that proper training should push personnel beyond their breaking point and rebuild them stronger than before. His philosophy wasn't necessarily wrong. It had produced generations of effective warriors and had been tested in the crucible of actual combat. But Sarah had spent enough time treating the long-term consequences of that philosophy to believe that there might be better ways to build the same level of capability without paying such a high price in broken bodies and shortened careers. As Colonel Davidson stepped to the microphone, the murmur of conversation died away instantly. 400 soldiers shifted into perfect attention, their movement creating a sound like distant thunder as boot heels clicked against concrete in near-perfect unison. The desert wind carried the faint scent of sage and creosote from beyond the base perimeter, mixing with the familiar military odors of gun oil, diesel fuel, and the particular smell of large numbers of people in uniform. Davidson's voice carried clearly across the parade ground without seeming to strain. He'd been addressing formations for long enough to understand exactly how to project authority while maintaining the kind of conversational tone that made soldiers feel like they were being spoken with rather than lectured at. His opening remarks covered the standard administrative items, upcoming training schedules, policy updates, recognition for outstanding performance during the previous month's exercises. But Sarah noticed that his tone shifted slightly as he began introducing the morning's demonstrations. There was a subtle undertone that suggested he was aware that some of what the assembled troops were about to see might challenge their preconceptions about military training and capability. His eyes found hers briefly as he began the introduction for her presentation, and she caught something that might have been encouragement mixed with professional curiosity. The first 2 demonstrations went smoothly enough. The small arms maintenance briefing covered new cleaning techniques that could extend weapon life in desert environments, complete with side-by-side comparisons that showed measurable improvements in reliability. The communications demonstration featured impressive new technology that could maintain contact across previously impossible distances, with real-time examples that had the assembled soldiers murmuring appreciation. When Davidson called Sarah's name, she stepped forward with the same steady pace she'd maintained since arriving at the base. No rush, no hesitation, just the confident movement of someone who had something useful to share and trusted that professional soldiers would recognize value when they saw it. The microphone adjustment took only a moment, and then she was looking out over 400 faces with the kind of calm attention that came from years of briefing medical personnel in high-stress situations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her opening was deliberately understated. Rather than launching into credentials or theoretical frameworks, she simply acknowledged that she was there to share some techniques that might help soldiers perform better and stay healthier during their careers. She spoke about the relationship between proper movement patterns and injury prevention, about the difference between strength that looked impressive and strength that translated into real-world capability, about the importance of understanding biomechanics in contexts where physical failure could have life-or-death consequences. The assembled troops listened with the professional courtesy that was standard for such briefings, but Sarah could sense the underlying skepticism. She was asking them to reconsider approaches to physical training that had been proven effective for generations, and she was doing it based on theories that most of them had never encountered in their military experience. It was exactly the reception she had expected, and exactly why she had prepared a demonstration rather than relying solely on explanation. She called for volunteers to assist with a simple movement assessment, something that would let her show the difference between compensated movement patterns and biomechanically sound technique. Half a dozen hands went up immediately. Soldiers who were confident enough in their physical capabilities to volunteer for public demonstration, or curious enough about her methods to risk whatever minor embarrassment might come from being corrected in front of their peers. What she hadn't anticipated was the voice that cut across the parade ground just as she was about to select her first volunteer. General Thornfield's words carried the kind of authority that could stop conversations in their tracks, and his tone suggested that he had just decided to turn a routine demonstration into something considerably more interesting. "Captain Chen," his voice boomed across the concrete expanse, causing every head to turn toward the platform where he stood. "I appreciate the scientific approach, but I think these soldiers might benefit from seeing something a bit more practical." The pause before that last word was deliberate, and Sarah could hear the challenge in it as clearly as if he had thrown down a gauntlet. Thornfield stepped down from the platform with the confident stride of a man who had never encountered a situation he couldn't handle through the application of superior will and physical capability. He was impressive in the way that career military officers often were. 6 feet of solid muscle carried on a frame that suggested he could still handle anything the service threw at him, despite being well past his physical prime. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his bearing was flawless, and his expression carried the kind of bemused confidence that came from watching countless young officers learn the difference between theory and practice. "With all due respect, Captain," he continued, his voice now conversational, but still carrying easily across the silent parade ground, "these soldiers don't need to learn how to move more efficiently. They need to understand what real strength looks like, and how to recognize it when they see it." He paused directly in front of her, close enough that their conversation could be heard clearly by the front ranks, but far enough away to maintain military propriety. Sarah felt the shift in energy as 400 soldiers realized they were about to witness something considerably more dramatic than a routine training briefing. The kind of tension that came when senior officers decided to make points through public demonstration rather than private conversation. She'd seen it before, and she recognized the particular challenge that Thornfield was presenting. He wasn't questioning her credentials or her knowledge. That would have been inappropriate given her background and the context of the briefing. Instead, he was questioning whether her approach could produce the kind of practical results that mattered in military contexts. It was a reasonable challenge from his perspective, and one that she would need to address directly if she wanted her program to have any credibility with the soldiers she was trying to help. But there was something else in his tone and posture that suggested this wasn't just about training philosophy. Thornfield had built his reputation on identifying and correcting weaknesses, on pushing people beyond what they thought were their limits, on demonstrating through personal example what proper military bearing and capability looked like. Sarah's presence at the base represented a different approach to those same goals, and her morning routine in the gym had probably been reported to him by soldiers who found her methods unusual enough to be worth mentioning. From his perspective, she probably looked like exactly the kind of theoretical expert who showed up periodically to explain why established methods were inadequate, armed with studies and credentials, but lacking the kind of practical experience that mattered when everything went wrong. The fact that she was barely 5'4" and appeared to weigh about as much as his left boot probably reinforced whatever doubts he might have about whether her methods could produce real-world results. "General," Sarah replied, her voice carrying clearly without seeming to strain, "I appreciate the opportunity to demonstrate practical applications." She paused just long enough to let that sink in before continuing. "What did you have in mind?" The challenge was now explicit, hanging in the desert air between them while 400 soldiers held their breath. Whatever happened next would become part of base legend, retold in barracks conversations for years to come. Sarah could feel the weight of all those eyes, could sense the mixture of curiosity and anticipation that came when routine proceedings suddenly became considerably more interesting. Thornfield smiled, and it was the kind of expression that suggested he was about to enjoy himself considerably. "Well, Captain, since you're here to teach us about strength and proper movement, perhaps you could demonstrate for us. I'm thinking something simple. Something that would show these soldiers what real capability looks like when it's properly applied." He gestured toward a section of the parade ground where various pieces of training equipment had been staged for the morning's demonstrations. Among them was a standard military fitness obstacle that Sarah recognized from her own training years, a series of progressively more challenging tests of functional strength and endurance. But Thornfield's attention wasn't focused on the equipment. Instead, he was looking directly at her with the kind of expression that suggested he had just thought of something that would make his point more effectively than any piece of training apparatus. "Actually, Captain, let me propose something even more practical. These soldiers need to understand that real strength isn't about perfect form or efficient movement patterns. It's about results. It's about being able to do what needs to be done when everything else has failed." The pause that followed stretched long enough for Sarah to understand that whatever came next was going to be considerably more dramatic than a routine fitness demonstration. She could feel the anticipation building among the assembled soldiers, could sense the shift in energy that came when routine proceedings suddenly became high-stakes theater. "So here's my challenge, Captain Chen," Thornfield continued, his voice now carrying the kind of authority that made it clear this wasn't really a request. "I weigh 230 pounds. I've been training soldiers for 25 years, and I've never met anyone who could physically move me without my cooperation. If your methods are truly superior to traditional military training, if proper biomechanics really can produce strength that exceeds what we can achieve through proven techniques, then I'm sure you won't have any trouble giving these soldiers a demonstration they'll never forget." The challenge was now unmistakable. 400 soldiers stood in perfect silence, waiting to see how the small woman with the advanced degrees would respond to a direct test of her theories against the reality of superior size and strength. From the platform, she could see Colonel Davidson watching with the expression of someone who was trying to decide whether to intervene before things got out of hand. But Sarah had faced this kind of challenge before, in different contexts, but with the same underlying assumptions. The belief that size trumped technique, that traditional approaches were inherently superior to innovation, that credentials on paper couldn't substitute for proven results in practice. She'd learned long ago that the only effective response was demonstration, and she'd also learned that the most dramatic demonstrations often came from situations where the odds seemed most heavily stacked against success. "General Thornfield," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent parade ground, "I accept your challenge." The words were simple, delivered without bravado or theatrical emphasis, just a straightforward acknowledgement of the test that had been proposed. "But I'd like to suggest a modification that might make this more instructive for the soldiers watching." Thornfield's eyebrows rose slightly, suggesting that he hadn't expected her to not only accept the challenge, but to propose changes to it. "I'm listening, Captain." Rather than simply demonstrating that proper technique can overcome size advantages, Sarah continued, "what if we structure this as a teaching moment? You've challenged me to move you against your resistance. I'll accept that challenge, but I'd also like to explain what I'm doing as I do it, so these soldiers can understand the principles involved rather than just witnessing the results." The request was reasonable enough. Turning physical demonstration into educational opportunity was standard practice in military training contexts. But Sarah could see in Thornfield's expression that he suspected she was buying time or looking for ways to make excuses if her techniques failed to produce the promised results. His smile suggested that he was perfectly happy to let her explain her theories while she failed to apply them effectively. Outstanding, Captain. I think these soldiers would benefit greatly from understanding exactly how your methods work in practice. The emphasis on exactly made it clear that he expected those methods to work considerably less well than advertised, and that the educational value would come from watching theoretical approaches meet practical reality. The space between them seemed to contract as Thornfield positioned himself with the casual confidence of someone who had never been moved against his will by anyone weighing less than 200 pounds. His stance was relaxed but stable, weight distributed evenly between both feet, center of gravity low and controlled. He wasn't trying to make himself impossible to move, that would have been unsporting, but he was clearly prepared to resist any reasonable attempt with the kind of strength that came from decades of military physical training. 400 soldiers leaned forward almost as one, some unconsciously rising on their toes to get better sight lines. The morning heat was already beginning to build, but nobody seemed to notice the temperature as all attention focused on the small woman facing down the seasoned general in the center of the parade ground. Sarah took a moment to visually assess her opponent, not with the quick glance of casual evaluation, but with the methodical attention of someone who understood that proper technique began with accurate analysis. She noted his stance, his balance points, the way he carried his weight, and the subtle tension patterns that suggested how he was preparing to resist her efforts. It was information that would be crucial for what came next, assuming her assessment of the situation was accurate. "General," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the silent assembly, "you're standing in what we call a power position. Feet shoulder width apart, weight evenly distributed, center of gravity low and stable. It's exactly how we teach soldiers to stand when they need to resist external forces, and it's very effective against direct applications of strength." She paused to let that observation sink in before continuing. "But every stable position has leverage points that can be exploited if you understand the biomechanical principles involved. Rather than trying to overcome your strength directly, which would be inefficient and probably unsuccessful given our size difference, I'm going to redirect your own stability against itself." Thornfield's smile widened slightly. This was exactly the kind of theoretical explanation he had expected. Complex reasoning that might sound impressive in academic settings, but would prove inadequate when tested against simple physical reality. He'd heard similar explanations from martial arts instructors, sports scientists, and various other experts who believed that proper technique could overcome obvious physical disadvantages. In his experience, such theories tended to work well in controlled demonstrations with cooperative partners, but considerably less well when facing genuine resistance from motivated opponents. "Fascinating, Captain. Please demonstrate this redirection technique for us." Sarah moved closer, close enough to place her hands on Thornfield's shoulders in a grip that looked almost gentle compared to the kind of powerful holds that the assembled soldiers might have expected. Her positioning seemed casual, almost conversational, as if she were simply getting his attention rather than preparing to attempt something that should have been physically impossible given their size difference. "The key," she continued, her voice still carrying clearly despite her proximity to Thornfield, "is identifying the precise point where stability becomes liability. General Thornfield is standing in a position that makes him very difficult to push or pull in any direct line of force. But that same stability depends on maintaining specific relationships between his feet, his center of gravity, and the ground." Her hands shifted slightly on his shoulders, and several soldiers in the front ranks noticed that her grip had changed from casual contact to something more purposeful, though still nothing that looked like the kind of aggressive hold they might have expected. Instead, she seemed to be feeling for something, testing responses to minor adjustments in pressure and position. "When you disrupt those relationships in the right sequence," Sarah said, her voice taking on the kind of instructional tone that suggested she was approaching the critical moment, Stability becomes momentum, and resistance becomes assistance. What happened next took place so quickly that most of the assembled soldiers would need to rely on each other's observations to piece together the complete sequence. Sarah's hands moved with precise, controlled motion, not the explosive burst of effort that might have been expected, but something more like the careful manipulation of a complex mechanism where timing mattered more than force. Her left hand maintained contact with Thornfield's right shoulder, while her right hand moved to a specific point just below his left shoulder blade. A slight shift of her weight, combined with what looked like a minor adjustment of his balance, caused him to take a small step to maintain his footing. That step, barely 6 inches and probably unconscious on his part, was apparently exactly what Sarah had been waiting for. The moment his weight shifted onto his right foot, she moved with the kind of fluid precision that looked almost choreographed. Her left hand guided his shoulder in a specific direction, while her right hand provided what seemed like minimal pressure to his back. But instead of trying to overcome his stability through superior force, she appeared to be using his own balance, reactions to create momentum in the direction she wanted him to move. Thornfield found himself turning, not because he was being forced to turn, but because maintaining his balance required turning. Sarah's hands guided that turn with subtle adjustments that kept him moving in a controlled arc, his own strength and stability working to continue the motion she had initiated. It was like watching someone redirect a river, not stopping the flow of force, but channeling it in a new direction. And then, as he completed approximately 1 full turn and found himself slightly off balance from the unexpected movement, Sarah did something that made several soldiers in the front ranks gasp out loud. Instead of continuing the circular motion, she stepped in close to his center of gravity, positioned herself with surgical precision, and executed what could only be described as a perfect biomechanical lift. Her hands found leverage points that seemed to turn Thornfield's own body weight into assistance rather than resistance. Her legs provided the power, but in a way that looked almost effortless, not the straining maximum effort attempt that might have been expected, but a smooth, controlled application of force that lifted all 230 pounds of the general completely off the ground. For a moment that seemed to stretch far longer than was physically possible, General Marcus Thornfield was suspended in the air above Captain Sarah Chen's head, held there with what appeared to be casual ease by a woman who weighed less than 60% of what he did. His expression had shifted from confident amusement to complete astonishment, and he was clearly trying to process how he had gone from stable, grounded resistance to airborne passenger in the space of perhaps 5 seconds. The silence from the assembled soldiers was absolute. 400 people stood frozen, not quite able to process what they had just witnessed. This wasn't a controlled demonstration with a cooperative partner. They had watched their general position himself to resist, had seen him prepare to make this as difficult as possible, had witnessed his confident expectation that superior size and strength would prevail over theoretical technique. But Sarah wasn't finished with her demonstration. Rather than simply setting Thornfield back down and accepting the amazed reactions of the crowd, she held him aloft for what felt like an eternity, but was probably no more than 3 or 4 seconds. Long enough for every soldier on that parade ground to see clearly that this was not a trick, not a momentary fluke, but a controlled demonstration of technique that had overcome what should have been overwhelming physical disadvantage. When she finally did lower him back to the ground, it was with the same controlled precision she had used for the lift itself. No sudden drop, no indication of strain or fatigue, just a smooth reversal of the process that had put him there in the first place. Thornfield's feet touched the concrete with barely a sound, and he immediately stepped back with the instinctive reaction of someone who was still trying to understand how his world had just been turned upside down. The first sound to break the silence was a low whistle from somewhere in the ranks of 3rd Battalion, followed immediately by a murmur of amazed conversation that rippled through the formation like wind through wheat. Soldiers turned to each other with expressions that suggested they needed confirmation, that they had really seen what they thought they had seen. The whispered conversations began building toward a general buzz of discussion before Colonel Davidson's sharp call for attention brought the formation back to silence. But the silence now felt different. Where it had been expectant before, waiting to see how an academic challenge would play out, it was now charged with a different kind of energy. Sarah had just demonstrated something that challenged fundamental assumptions about strength, technique, and what was possible when proper principles were applied with sufficient skill. From the platform, Major General Wells was watching with the kind of intense attention that suggested she was already thinking about implications beyond the immediate demonstration. Colonel Davidson's expression had shifted from polite concern to genuine professional interest. And throughout the ranks of assembled soldiers, she could see faces that reflected everything from amazement to skepticism, to the particular kind of thoughtfulness that came when people were forced to reconsider beliefs they had held without question. General Thornfield himself was standing very still, his expression cycling through what looked like genuine confusion, grudging respect, and something that might have been embarrassment. Not the humiliation of someone who had been made to look foolish, but the more complex discomfort of someone whose certainties had just been challenged in a very public way. Sarah stepped back to give him space, then addressed the assembled formation with the same calm professionalism she had maintained throughout the encounter. The techniques I just demonstrated are based on principles that can be taught and learned by anyone willing to understand the biomechanical foundations involved. They don't require exceptional strength or natural talent, just proper instruction and sufficient practice to develop muscle memory. Her voice carried easily across the parade ground, and she could see that she had the complete attention of every soldier present. What you witnessed wasn't magic, and it wasn't a trick. It was the application of leverage, timing, and biomechanical advantage to achieve a result that would be impossible through direct force application. These same principles can be applied to improve performance in every aspect of military training, from weapons handling to equipment transport to combat techniques. She paused to let that sink in before continuing with what would become the most quoted portion of her presentation. General Thornfield challenged me to demonstrate real strength, and I appreciate the opportunity. But I want you to understand that what you saw wasn't about my strength versus his. It was about the difference between working harder and working smarter, between applying force and applying force efficiently. The murmur of conversation that followed was more subdued than before, but Sarah could sense that it carried a different quality. These were professional soldiers discussing professional topics, trying to understand the practical implications of what they had witnessed for their own training and capability development. Exactly the kind of response she had hoped to achieve, though through considerably more dramatic means than she had originally planned. General Thornfield cleared his throat, and the conversation died away immediately. When he spoke, his voice carried across the parade ground with the same authority as before, but there was something different in his tone. Not defeat exactly, but perhaps the acknowledgement that he had learned something he hadn't expected to learn. "Captain Chun," he said, and there was no trace of his earlier amusement in the words. That was instructive. I think I speak for everyone present when I say that we'd all benefit from understanding more about these techniques and how they might be incorporated into our existing training programs. It was as close to a public admission of error as anyone was likely to get from a general officer, and Sarah appreciated the grace with which he was handling what had to be a difficult moment. She nodded respectfully before responding. "Thank you, General. I'll be conducting training sessions throughout the next several weeks for anyone interested in learning more about biomechanical applications in military contexts. The techniques we demonstrated today represent just one small portion of what's possible when proper principles are applied consistently." Colonel Davidson stepped forward to resume control of the formation, but before he could speak, General Thornfield raised his hand for one final comment. The parade ground fell silent again, waiting to hear what he would say about what had just transpired. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of addressing soldiers, "what we just witnessed represents something important about military service and personal development. Sometimes our assumptions about strength, about capability, about what's possible are challenged in ways that force us to expand our understanding." He paused, his eyes moving across the assembled ranks before settling briefly on Sarah. "Captain Chen has reminded us that expertise can come in unexpected packages, that innovation doesn't diminish tradition, but can enhance it, and that true strength often looks different than we expect it to look." The words were generous, particularly given the very public nature of what had just occurred, and Sarah felt a flicker of respect for the way Thornfield was choosing to frame the lesson for his soldiers. This was leadership in action, taking a moment of personal challenge and turning it into an opportunity for broader learning. "I expect all of you to approach Captain Chun's training sessions with the same openness to learning that has always characterized professional military development," he continued. "What she has to teach us may challenge some of your assumptions about physical training and capability, but I think today's demonstration suggests that those challenges are worth taking seriously." With that, he stepped back and nodded to Colonel Davidson, who immediately moved to dismiss the formation and transition to the day's regular training schedule. But as the ranks began to dissolve and soldiers started moving toward their next assignments, the conversations that Sarah could overhear suggested that this morning's demonstration would be discussed and analyzed for considerably longer than any routine training briefing. As the crowd dispersed, Sarah found herself surrounded by small groups of soldiers asking questions about training schedules, technique details, and practical applications of what they had just witnessed. The skepticism that had been evident during her opening remarks had been replaced by genuine professional curiosity, and several senior non-commissioned officers were already discussing how these principles might be integrated into existing physical training programs. From across the parade ground, she caught sight of General Thornfield, watching the interactions with an expression that suggested he was processing more than just the immediate implications of his public demonstration. When their eyes met, he offered a slight nod that seemed to acknowledge both the skill she had demonstrated and the professionalism with which she was handling the aftermath. Later that afternoon, Sarah would receive a message requesting her presence at a meeting with the base's senior staff to discuss expansion of her training program and potential integration of her methods into standard protocols. The request would come directly from General Thornfield's office, along with a note suggesting that he looked forward to learning more about biomechanical applications in military contexts. But for now, as the desert sun climbed higher and the normal rhythm of base operations resumed around her, Sarah simply answered questions from curious soldiers and began planning how to turn one dramatic demonstration into a comprehensive program that could genuinely improve the lives and capabilities of the people she had come to serve. The morning's events had proven something important about the relationship between innovation and tradition, about the value of challenging assumptions, and about the unexpected places where real strength could be found. 400 soldiers had witnessed a demonstration that would change how they thought about training, capability, and the importance of keeping an open mind when confronted with new ideas. And somewhere in the middle of all those conversations and questions, Sarah realized that General Thornfield's challenge had given her something invaluable, not just the opportunity to demonstrate her methods, but the chance to earn the kind of credibility that could only come from proving herself under pressure in front of the people she was trying to help. The mess hall at Fort Meridian buzzed with conversation that evening, but the usual topics of conversation had been replaced by animated discussions of biomechanics, leverage ratios, and the physics of human movement. Soldiers who normally debated sports scores and weekend plans were now sketching diagrams on napkins, trying to work out exactly how someone weighing 130 pounds had managed to lift a 230-pound general over her head with what appeared to be minimal effort. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison sat with his usual lunch crew at a corner table, absently stirring his coffee while listening to Specialist Davis attempt to explain fulcrum points using salt and pepper shakers as visual aids. Morrison had been one of the soldiers Sarah had noticed during formation, the one compensating for an old jump injury that had never quite healed properly. 3 years of living with chronic knee pain had taught him to be skeptical of miracle cures and revolutionary training methods. But what he'd witnessed that morning had shaken some of his assumptions about what was possible. "I'm telling you, it's all about angles," Davis insisted, positioning the condiments to demonstrate his theory. She didn't try to deadlift him straight up. She got underneath his center of gravity and used his own weight to create momentum in the direction she wanted him to go. Corporal Martinez, a combat engineer who'd spent enough time with mechanical systems to understand leverage in practical terms, shook his head skeptically. "Angles or no angles, there's no way someone that small generates enough force to lift. Someone that big without some kind of trick involved. Maybe the general was helping more than it looked like." "You think Thornfield was faking it?" Morrison asked, genuinely curious about his teammates' perspective. "In front of 400 soldiers? That man's got enough pride to fill a hangar. No way he'd make himself look weak just to help some consultant prove a point." The debate continued around the table, with each soldier offering theories based on their own training and experience. But Morrison noticed that none of them were dismissing what they'd seen entirely. These were practical people who dealt with mechanical systems, explosive devices, and equipment that had to work reliably under extreme conditions. They understood the difference between theoretical possibilities and real-world results, and what they'd witnessed that morning had definitely produced real-world results. 3 tables away, Lieutenant Rodriguez was having a similar conversation with her platoon leaders, though their discussion carried the additional weight of command responsibility. As officers, they were expected to evaluate new training methods not just for their own potential benefit, but for their impact on the soldiers under their supervision. Rodriguez had been dealing with her shoulder injury for 6 months, managing the pain with over-the-counter medication and carefully modified training routines that kept her functional but didn't address the underlying problem. "The question isn't whether what she did was impressive," Rodriguez said, keeping her voice low enough that their conversation wouldn't carry to nearby tables. "The question is whether her methods can actually improve performance for regular soldiers dealing with normal training challenges." Sergeant First Class Williams, a veteran instructor who'd been teaching combat techniques for 8 years, nodded thoughtfully. "I've seen a lot of specialists come through here with new ideas about how we should be doing things differently. Most of them have fancy degrees and impressive theories, but when it comes to practical application in field conditions, their methods don't hold up. But most of them don't demonstrate their theories by lifting a general over their head in front of half the base," Lieutenant Peterson pointed out. Peterson was the youngest of the group, fresh enough from officer training to still be enthusiastic about innovation, but experienced enough to understand the importance of proven techniques in military contexts. Williams conceded the point with a slight smile. "Fair enough. That was definitely the most dramatic training demonstration I've ever witnessed. But impressive demonstrations don't always translate into useful training programs. We'll need to see how her methods work with soldiers who aren't hand-picked volunteers, dealing with real injuries and real limitations." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Master Sergeant Elena Vasquez, the senior non-commissioned officer responsible for coordinating training programs across multiple companies. Vasquez had spent the afternoon in meetings with Colonel Davidson and other senior staff, discussing the practical implications of potentially integrating new training methods into existing protocols. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, settling into an empty chair without waiting for an answer. The other officers shifted slightly to make room, recognizing the subtle but important protocol that governed interactions between commissioned and non-commissioned leadership in informal settings. "We were just discussing this morning's demonstration," Rodriguez explained, "trying to figure out whether what Captain Chen showed us represents a genuine improvement over current methods, or just an impressive one-time display." Vasquez nodded, her expression suggesting that she'd been wrestling with similar questions throughout the afternoon. "I've been thinking about the same thing. From a training standpoint, there are some interesting possibilities, but there are also some practical concerns about implementation and safety protocols." She paused to take a sip of coffee before continuing. "The colonel asked me to put together a preliminary assessment of how these techniques might be integrated into existing programs. That means figuring out instructor qualification requirements, equipment needs, safety considerations, and measurable performance metrics." The discussion that followed revealed the complexity of translating dramatic demonstrations into systematic training programs. Military education required standardized curricula, qualified instructors, measurable objectives, and documented safety protocols. Individual brilliance was impressive, but institutional change required careful planning and systematic implementation. "What did you think of her explanation of the techniques?" Peterson asked. "She made it sound like these principles could be taught to anyone, but that seems optimistic given the level of precision required." Vasquez considered the question carefully before responding. "That's probably the most important question we need to answer. If these techniques require exceptional natural ability or years of specialized training, they're not practical for general military application. But if they really can be taught systematically to regular soldiers, they could represent a significant improvement in capability." Williams leaned forward, his expression reflecting the professional skepticism that came from years of evaluating training innovations. "I keep coming back to the force multiplication aspect. If proper technique really can overcome size and strength disadvantages that dramatically, it changes the fundamental assumptions we make about physical requirements for different military specialties." The comment touched on something that had been bothering several of the officers throughout the day. Military personnel standards were based on decades of experience about minimum physical requirements for various duties. If those standards were based on inefficient techniques rather than optimal ones, it raised questions about everything from recruitment criteria to job assignment protocols. Rodriguez shifted in her chair, unconsciously favoring her injured shoulder. "There's another aspect to consider. A lot of us are dealing with injuries or physical limitations that affect our performance. If these methods can help soldiers work around those limitations more effectively, that could extend careers and improve overall unit capability." The personal dimension of the conversation was something that Vasquez had been thinking about. Throughout the afternoon, military medicine had made enormous strides in treating acute injuries, but chronic pain and movement limitations were still common problems that were typically managed rather than resolved. The possibility of training techniques that could address those issues represented more than just performance improvement. It could literally change soldiers' quality of life. Meanwhile, in a smaller dining area reserved for senior staff, General Thornfield was having his own conversation about the morning's events. Colonel Davidson sat across from him, along with Major General Wells, who had extended her visit specifically to discuss the implications of what she'd witnessed during the formation. The atmosphere was considerably more formal than the enlisted. Discussions taking place throughout the mess hall, but the underlying questions were remarkably similar. How could the techniques be evaluated objectively? What were the practical requirements for implementation? And most importantly, what were the potential benefits and risks of changing established training methods? "I'll admit," Thornfield said, cutting into his steak with perhaps more force than necessary, "that I didn't expect this morning to go the way it did. When I issued that challenge, I was thinking about demonstrating the importance of practical experience over theoretical knowledge. Davidson nodded diplomatically. As the base commander, he'd spent the afternoon fielding questions from senior staff who wanted to understand the official position on potential changes to training protocols. The demonstration was certainly effective at capturing everyone's attention. The question now is how we move forward in a way that serves the mission and the soldiers. Major General Wells, who had been largely silent during the meal, looked up from her notes. "I've been reviewing Captain Chun's background more thoroughly this afternoon. Her credentials are impressive, but more importantly, her practical experience suggests she understands military requirements and limitations." She referred to a folder beside her plate, filled with documents that hadn't been readily available. That morning, 8 years as a Navy corpsman, including combat deployments, advanced training in trauma medicine and field surgery, multiple commendations for performance under fire. This isn't someone who developed theories in academic isolation. Thornfield paused in his eating, recognizing the implicit criticism in that assessment. His challenge that morning had been based partly on assumptions about Chun's background that were apparently incomplete. "I wasn't aware of the extent of her combat experience," which raises an interesting question about how we evaluate expertise and credibility, Wells continued. "Chun could have mentioned her military background during her presentation, could have used it to establish authority before attempting her demonstration. Instead, she let her techniques speak for themselves." The observation hung in the air for a moment, reflecting an aspect of the morning's events that none of them had fully considered. Chun had accepted Thornfield's challenge without invoking her military experience, without attempting to establish credentials that might have changed the dynamic of the encounter. She had simply demonstrated competence and let the results speak for themselves. Davidson cleared his throat, recognizing that the conversation was approaching territory that required careful navigation. "Regardless of how we got here, we need to decide how to proceed. We have a specialist with apparently valuable techniques, a base full of soldiers who are interested in learning more, and senior leadership that needs to evaluate potential changes to established programs. What's your recommendation, Colonel?" Wells asked, though her tone suggested she had already formed her own opinions about the appropriate course of action. Davidson had spent the afternoon considering exactly that question, weighing operational requirements against innovation opportunities. "I think we should establish a pilot program. Small scale initially, with carefully selected volunteers and comprehensive documentation of results. If the techniques prove effective under controlled conditions, we can consider broader implementation." It was a reasonable approach that balanced institutional caution with openness to innovation. Military organizations were necessarily conservative about changing proven methods, but they were also committed to continuous improvement in capability and effectiveness. Thornfield nodded slowly, his expression suggesting that he was still processing the personal implications of the morning's events. "I think that makes sense, but I'd recommend that we also consider the broader lessons about assumption-making and evaluation criteria. This morning taught me something about the importance of keeping an open mind when confronting new ideas." The admission was significant, representing the kind of professional growth that military leadership required, but didn't always acknowledge publicly. Wells made a note in her folder, recognizing that Thornfield's perspective would be important for any formal reports about the day's events. Back in the main dining area, conversations were beginning to wind down as soldiers prepared for evening duties and personal time. But the discussions about technique, biomechanics, and training innovation continued in smaller groups throughout the base, creating a kind of distributed analysis of the morning's demonstration that would influence attitudes and expectations for weeks to come. Sarah Chen spent her evening in her quarters, reviewing notes and planning for the training sessions that would begin the following week. Word had spread quickly about the opportunity to learn the techniques demonstrated that morning, and the sign-up lists had filled faster than she'd anticipated. Soldiers from every company had volunteered, representing a cross-section of specialties, experience levels, and physical capabilities that would provide excellent data about the broader applicability of her methods. But as she prepared lesson plans and safety protocols, Sarah was also thinking about the larger implications of what had occurred. The challenge from General Thornfield had been unexpected, but it had achieved something that months of formal presentations and credential reviews might not have accomplished. She now had the attention and interest of soldiers who were genuinely motivated to learn, rather than people who were attending training because it was required. The dramatic nature of the demonstration had also created expectations that would need to be managed carefully. Soldiers would arrive at training sessions expecting to learn techniques that would let them lift opponents twice their size, but the reality was more nuanced. What she had demonstrated represented the culmination of years of study and practice, applied in a specific situation with particular advantages. Teaching those principles to others would require breaking down complex movements into teachable components, developing progression sequences that built capability systematically, and creating safety protocols that prevented injury during the learning process. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Colonel Davidson's office, requesting her presence at a meeting the following morning to discuss program development and resource allocation. The message was brief and professional, but Sarah recognized it as an indication that her demonstration had achieved its intended effect. She now had the institutional support necessary to implement her ideas on a meaningful scale. As she settled in for the evening, Sarah reflected on the unexpected turn that her assignment at Fort Meridian had taken. She had arrived expecting to work quietly with medical personnel and small groups of injured soldiers, developing rehabilitation techniques that would help individuals recover from specific problems. Instead, she found herself at the center of a base-wide discussion about training philosophy, physical capability, and the relationship between innovation and tradition. The next morning brought a return to the normal rhythm of base operations, but with an undercurrent of anticipation that was noticeable throughout the installation. Soldiers went about their regular duties with the usual professionalism, but conversations in the chow lines and maintenance bays frequently returned to questions about leverage, momentum, and the physics of human movement. Sarah's meeting with the senior staff confirmed that her pilot program would receive full institutional support, including dedicated training space, qualified medical oversight, and comprehensive documentation requirements. Colonel Davidson had clearly spent considerable time developing implementation plans that would allow for systematic evaluation of results while maintaining safety and operational readiness standards. "We're treating this as a formal research and development initiative," Davidson explained, referring to a thick folder of documents that outline protocols, objectives, and success metrics. "That means careful documentation of techniques, systematic evaluation of student progress, and objective measurement of performance improvements." The approach was more comprehensive than Sarah had expected, reflecting the military's commitment to evidence-based decision-making when evaluating potential changes to established procedures. It would require more administrative work than she had originally anticipated, but it would also provide the kind of institutional credibility that could lead to adoption across other installations. General Thornfield attended the meeting, his presence representing both official endorsement of the program and personal commitment to understanding the techniques that had caught him so completely off guard. His questions were thoughtful and practical, focusing on instructor qualification requirements and scalability considerations rather than the theoretical foundations that had originally concerned him. "How long does it typically take for students to develop proficiency with these techniques?" he asked, reviewing the proposed training timeline that Sarah had submitted. "That depends on how we define proficiency," Sarah replied, consulting her own notes about progression sequences and skill development. "Basic understanding of principles can be achieved in a few sessions. Practical application of simple techniques might take several weeks of consistent practice. Advanced applications like what you witnessed yesterday require months or years of systematic training. The answer reflected the reality that impressive demonstrations represented the culmination of extensive preparation, not techniques that could be mastered quickly. But it also suggested that meaningful improvements in capability could be achieved much more rapidly, providing value to students even during early stages of training. Major General Wells, who had been taking notes throughout the discussion, looked up with a question that addressed one of the most important practical considerations. What are your thoughts about instructor development? If this program proves successful, we'll need qualified people to teach these techniques at other installations. It was exactly the kind of long-term thinking that separated successful pilot programs from isolated experiments. Sarah had been considering the same question, recognizing that her individual expertise would need to be systematized and transferred to others if the techniques were to have broader impact. I've been developing instructor certification protocols based on my experience with similar programs in civilian contexts, she explained. The key is creating systematic progression from student to assistant instructor to fully qualified teacher, with objective competency standards at each level. The discussion continued for 2 more hours, covering everything from equipment requirements to legal liability considerations. By the end of the meeting, Sarah had a clear mandate to proceed with comprehensive program development, backed by resources and institutional support that exceeded her most optimistic expectations. That afternoon, she conducted her first formal training session with a group of 12 volunteers representing different companies and specialties. The session took place in a converted warehouse space that had been equipped with mats, mirrors, and basic training equipment, creating an environment that was professional without being intimidating. The soldiers who attended ranged from young privates eager to learn new techniques to senior non-commissioned officers who were curious about practical applications for their own units. Several, including Staff Sergeant Morrison, were dealing with chronic injuries that affected their performance and quality of life. Others were simply interested in understanding the principles behind what they'd witnessed during the formation. Demonstration. Sarah began with a brief overview of biomechanical concepts, explaining the relationship between leverage, momentum, and efficient force application in terms that drew on the soldiers' existing knowledge of mechanical systems. Physics. She was careful to emphasize that what they would be learning represented principles that could be applied across many different contexts, not just dramatic lifting techniques. The goal isn't to turn everyone into circus performers, she explained, earning chuckles from several students. The goal is to help you understand how your body works as a mechanical system, so you can move more efficiently, avoid injury, and perform better in whatever situations you encounter. The first exercises were simple movement assessments that let Sarah evaluate each student's current capabilities and identify areas where improved technique could provide immediate benefits. She watched carefully as soldiers performed basic movements like squatting, lifting, and carrying, noting compensation patterns and inefficiencies that could be addressed through proper instruction. What she observed was exactly what she'd expected, based on her experience with military personnel. These were people who were generally fit and capable, but who had learned movement patterns through trial and error rather than systematic instruction. Most were stronger and more athletic than they needed to be to accomplish their tasks, compensating for inefficient technique through superior physical conditioning. Sergeant Morrison, she called, noticing the way he favored his left knee during a simple lifting exercise. "Could you come over here for a moment?" Morrison approached with the slightly wary expression of someone who suspected he was about to become a demonstration subject. But Sarah's tone was reassuring rather than confrontational. "I noticed you're compensating for some discomfort in your knee. How long has that been an issue?" "About 3 years," Morrison replied, unconsciously shifting his weight to reduce pressure on the affected joint. Old parachute landing that didn't go according to plan. It's manageable, but it definitely affects my performance during longer training exercises. Sarah nodded, recognizing the pattern she'd seen countless times in her clinical work. Would you be willing to let me show the group how small changes in movement patterns can reduce stress on injured joints? It might help with your discomfort, and it'll demonstrate some important principles for everyone else. Morrison agreed, and Sarah guided him through a series of modified movements that redistributed forces more evenly across his body. The changes were subtle adjustments in foot position, slight modifications to his lifting technique, minor alterations in how he carried weight. But the effect was immediately noticeable, both to Morrison and to the other students watching the demonstration. That's significantly better, Morrison admitted, his surprise evident in his voice. I can actually feel the difference in pressure on the joint. The demonstration continued with other students, each presenting different challenges that let Sarah illustrate various applications of biomechanical principles. A soldier with chronic back pain learned how changes in lifting technique could reduce spinal stress. Another student discovered that modifications to his running gait could improve efficiency and reduce fatigue. Each example reinforced the central message that small improvements in technique could produce significant improvements in performance and comfort. By the end of the 2-hour session, every student had experienced at least one moment of recognition, a sudden understanding of how proper technique could address problems they'd been living with or improve capabilities they thought were fixed. Several asked about additional training opportunities, and Morrison specifically requested information about therapeutic applications for his knee injury. As the students gathered their equipment and prepared to leave, Sarah overheard conversations that suggested the session had achieved its primary objective. Instead of discussing the dramatic lifting techniques they'd probably expected to learn, soldiers were talking about practical applications for their daily duties and personal challenges. Did you see how much easier that carrying technique was? One soldier asked his partner. I'm going to try that during the next field exercise. I had no idea I was putting that much unnecessary stress on my back, another commented. No wonder I'm always sore after long marchers. The feedback reinforced Sarah's belief that the most valuable applications of her techniques weren't the dramatic demonstrations that captured attention, but the subtle improvements that enhanced daily performance and reduced cumulative wear on the body. Teaching soldiers to move more efficiently wouldn't just make them more capable, it would help them maintain that capability throughout longer, healthier careers. Over the following weeks, word about the training session spread throughout Fort Meridian and beyond. Soldiers who attended Sarah's classes shared techniques with their units, creating a ripple effect that extended her influence far beyond the formal program participants. The base medical staff reported a noticeable decrease in training-related injuries, particularly the minor strains and overuse problems that typically accumulated during intensive training periods. More significantly, performance metrics in several companies showed measurable improvements in tasks that required lifting, carrying, and sustained physical effort. Soldiers were completing the same training exercises with less fatigue, recovering more quickly between sessions, and reporting fewer complaints about chronic pain and discomfort. The success of the pilot program attracted attention from senior leadership throughout the military education system. Representatives from other installations requested information about Sarah's techniques, and several officer education programs expressed interest in incorporating biomechanical training into their curricula. General Thornfield, who had become one of the program's most vocal advocates, submitted a formal recommendation that Sarah's techniques be evaluated for adoption across multiple branches of service. His report, which included detailed analysis of performance improvements and injury reduction statistics, carried considerable weight given his initial skepticism and the public nature of his conversion to supporting the program. But perhaps The most significant validation came from the soldiers themselves. Training session attendance remained consistently high week after week, with soldiers voluntarily dedicating their personal time to learning techniques that improved their professional capabilities. The enthusiasm was genuine and sustained, reflecting the practical value that participants found in Sarah's instruction. 3 months after her demonstration on the parade ground, Sarah received orders reassigning her to the Pentagon, where she would lead a joint services initiative to develop standardized biomechanical training protocols for military-wide implementation. The assignment represented exactly the kind of institutional change she had hoped to achieve, though through a much more dramatic path than she had originally anticipated. On her final day at Fort Meridian, Sarah conducted one last training session in the converted warehouse that had become her classroom. The session was attended not only by her regular students, but by dozens of soldiers who wanted to express their appreciation for the improvements she had helped them achieve in their performance and quality of life. General Thornfield made a brief appearance, ostensibly to observe the training but actually to offer personal thanks for lessons that extended far beyond physical technique. His presence represented a remarkable evolution from the skeptical challenger, who had questioned her credibility just a few months earlier. As Sarah packed her equipment and prepared to leave Fort Meridian, she reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this point. A single moment of challenge and response had created opportunities that careful planning and formal presentations might never have achieved. Sometimes the most effective way to change minds was simply to demonstrate possibilities that people hadn't previously considered. The base would continue its mission of training soldiers for challenging assignments around the world, but it would do so with enhanced understanding of human potential and improved techniques for developing that potential safely and effectively. The lessons learned at Fort Meridian would spread throughout the military education system, improving the lives and capabilities of countless soldiers who would never know the name of the small woman who had lifted a general over her head and changed how an entire institution thought about strength, technique, and the importance of keeping an open mind when confronted with new ideas. 5 years later, Colonel Sarah Chen stood before the International Military Training Conference in Brussels, addressing defense officials from 37 nations. The small woman who had once lifted a general over her head now directed biomechanical training programs across 4 branches of the United States military and consulted with allied forces worldwide. Her techniques had become standard curriculum at West Point, Annapolis, the Air Force Academy, and the Marine Corps War College. The conference hall fell silent as she began her presentation about injury prevention and performance optimization in modern military contexts. Behind her, slides displayed statistics that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. Training injuries reduced by 68% across participating units, performance metrics improved by an average of 35%, and career longevity extended by measurable margins in soldiers who received biomechanical instruction. But the numbers, impressive as they were, told only part of the story. In the audience sat General Marcus Thornfield, now retired, but serving as a special advisor on military education reform. His presence represented more than professional courtesy. It symbolized the complete transformation of institutional attitudes toward innovation and evidence-based training methods. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison, fully recovered from the knee injury that had plagued him for years, commanded his own training company at Fort Bragg, where he taught Sarah's techniques to Special Forces candidates. Lieutenant Rodriguez, promoted to major and free from chronic shoulder pain, led the Army's new Center for Human Performance Excellence. Master Sergeant Vasquez had become the military's leading expert on instructor certification for biomechanical training programs. The ripple effects extended far beyond individual success stories. Military medical facilities reported dramatic reductions in orthopedic surgeries and chronic pain cases. Recruitment standards had been refined to emphasize movement quality over Raw strength measurements. Training methodologies across all services now incorporated principles that Sarah had demonstrated on a dusty parade ground in Nevada. During the question period following her presentation, a young German officer asked about scalability challenges in implementing biomechanical training across large military organizations. Sarah's response drew on 5 years of experience converting institutional skepticism into systematic change. The key insight, she explained, is that dramatic demonstrations capture attention, but sustainable change requires proving value in everyday applications. When soldiers experience immediate improvements in their daily performance and reduced pain, they become advocates for continued learning. After the conference, Thornfield approached her in the lobby, his expression carrying the warmth of genuine friendship that had developed over years of professional collaboration. Hard to believe it all started with my stubborn refusal to accept that size wasn't everything, he said with a self-deprecating smile. Sarah laughed, remembering that morning when everything had changed with a single challenge and response. You gave me the opportunity to prove that proper technique could overcome physical disadvantages. Everything that followed grew from that moment. No, Thornfield replied seriously. You gave 400 soldiers the opportunity to see that their assumptions about strength and capability might be wrong. That's the difference between individual skill and institutional transformation. As evening fell over Brussels, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. A single demonstration had become a movement, individual techniques had become systematic programs, and one moment of challenge had catalyzed changes that improved the lives of thousands of military personnel worldwide. The lesson extended beyond military applications. In hospitals, physical therapy clinics, and athletic training facilities around the world, practitioners applied principles that had been proven first on a military parade ground. The understanding that proper biomechanics could multiply human capability had influenced everything from injury rehabilitation to Olympic training programs. But perhaps the most important legacy was less tangible, the demonstration that expertise could emerge from unexpected sources, that innovation and tradition could strengthen each other, and that the willingness to challenge assumptions could lead to discoveries that benefited everyone. The small woman who had once been underestimated because of her size had proven that true strength came not from physical dimensions, but from understanding, skill, and the courage to demonstrate capabilities when others doubted they existed. Her story had become legend, retold in training facilities and military academies as an example of how one moment of professional excellence could change an entire institution's understanding of human potential. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.